great pleasure to introduce John McNeill once again. Since I don't want to be accused of exaggeration, I'll just say very important environmental historian who's published lots of books, and I'll let John take it away.
Great. Thank you, Hugh. So today I'm going to speak for maybe 40 minutes. I'm not sure. I've not spoken about this before, so I never rehearsed it, so we'll see. About my latest project, which you can see here is part of a book about the environmental history of the Caribbean that should be published next month. And my part of this environmental history is about disease environments. The other authors in this book, Phil Morgan and Stuart Schwartz and Matthew Mulcahy, all Caribbeanists, indeed, more so than I. Part of this project is an outgrowth of Mosquito Empires, a book I published 11 plus years ago, and I know at least one person in the room has read that book, maybe two, maybe even more. But that part of it will be familiar, at least to Frank. But a great deal of this is new, particularly the long backward glance to the beginning of human habitation in the Caribbean, which involves the use of very different kinds of evidence, as I will explain. And another prefatory remark, as I practice it, the history of health and disease doesn't overlap all that much with the history of medicine. History of medicine is a very established genre for historians, and I'm not doing that. And indeed, in the period prior to 1850, medicine wasn't all that effective and therefore wasn't all that important in the health of peoples in the Caribbean. So here's the gist of what I have to say in this book. I am adding, I believe, a couple of new wrinkles to the study of Caribbean health and disease. One of these is the use of what's now called paleogenomics or paleogenetics. So in the last few years, geneticists have been using new techniques to try to learn things about the biological past and the human past through the study of two things. One is fossil DNA found on skeletons. There's a lot of difficulties in the interpretation of that. And the other is the genetics of currently existing populations. And each of these contains clues about health history. And I've tried to read what the specialists have had to say about this and use it in a historical narrative. And for the Caribbean, that's not been done before. The second thing that's new here is that I've conscripted the concept of syndemics from medical anthropology. And you can see a definition of syndemics by the originator of the term, Merrill Singer, in the bottom there. But the shorthand version is syndemics is intended to recognize the correlation between biological conditions and social conditions, and how in many instances social conditions can intensify the consequences of biological conditions. So Merrill Singer developed this in the context of HIV studies, and other medical anthropologists and medical scientists use it in the contemporary moment. I'm stealing it and using it in historical contexts, which, so far as I know at least, is also a new wrinkle. And one last thing that's a new wrinkle here is I'm assessing one piece of Caribbean health history, what I call the first syndemic, in a archipelagic context. That is, I look at other archipelagos around the world and their health history to try to judge likely in the Caribbean context. And that also, as far as I know, is a new way to contextualize the Caribbean experience. I look mainly at Pacific archipelagos. So the two syndemics that feature here are the Holocaust that was visited upon the indigenous population of the Caribbean after 1492, and the slave plantation regime, each of which count as among the grimmest chapters in the annals of human health, as I say here. But they're preceded by many thousands of years of what looks like comparatively good health history. So let me begin with that. So humans first showed up in the Caribbean, as far as we can tell from the archaeological evidence, about 7,200 years ago. And what we know about their health comes from bio-archeology and from paleogenomics. There are no texts. And there are no contributions from historical linguistics that go back that far. So the evidence is very skimpy, and the number of skeletons from which we can gather bioarchaeological data is in the hundreds, not the thousands. So that means what we think we know isn't very secure, and everything is provisional. But what it looks like is that this population in the Caribbean was unusually healthy as regards infectious disease. I made a list of what I thought were the 25 most important infectious diseases in human history. Only 3 of them existed in the Americas before 1492, and only 2 of them probably in the Caribbean. And those were tuberculosis and syphilis. And it's not even certain that syphilis existed there, but it does seem likely in the opinion of the experts. And the tuberculosis strain, interestingly enough, looks genetically like it is descended from one that arrived in the Americas on the coast of Peru via fur seals. Could be that the genetic evidence is misleading us there. The bioarchaeological evidence also tells us that people in the Caribbean, like people everywhere, had arthritis, bad teeth, plenty of malnutrition, but not killing infectious diseases, except for tuberculosis and syphilis, both of which are slow-acting killers, typically. Why might that be? So with respect to the Americas as a whole, there are some pretty plausible explanations why populations from Alaska to Patagonia were pretty healthy by world standards. And the main components of that pretty compelling answer are that there were no domesticated herd animals except for llamas, and the cousins of llamas, alpacas and vicuñas in the Andes. And this is important because many, if not most, of the acute viral infections that human populations have suffered from and still suffer from come to humans via domesticated herd animals, pigs, cattle, sheep, camels. They may have originated elsewhere, frequently among bats and rodents, but we get them typically, or got them in the mists of history, via big herd animals. And so that's one reason. Another reason is that when humans first came to the Americas, they didn't bring any herd animals. They brought only dogs with them. And they passed through a very cold environment, which may have weeded out some of the pathogens, disease-causing microbes, that they may have had in Siberia. That's uncertain. And then humans haven't been in the Americas all that long, maybe 18 to 25,000 years, which hasn't given them as much time to acquire species-jumping infections from animals as populations in Africa or Eurasia or even Australia have had. So those are some of the reasons why it makes sense that populations in the Americas should be healthier than average in world history. And in the Caribbean, many of these factors apply a bit more strongly. So people have only been there 7,000 years as opposed to 18 to 25,000. And there's only a brief history of agriculture, about 2,500 years ago. Agriculture is significant because it usually implies sedentary populations that, because they live amidst their own filth, develop diseases of sanitation, typically gastrointestinal infections that mobile populations do not typically get. So a short history of agriculture means less chance to develop a nice suite of gastrointestinal diseases. So those are some general points that might help us understand in the Caribbean the good health experience that the evidence implies. So in short, it's an extreme version of the story of the Americas. But at the same time, even though the evidence suggests very little in the way of infectious disease, life expectancy, as inferred from skeletons, is very average by world historical standards of archaic and ancient populations. So on the order of an average of 25 to 30 years life expectancy at birth. So something else other than infectious disease has to explain this. And it's by no means clear what that might be, but the range of possibilities is pretty low. Famine, violence, disasters, but we have no idea. So that is the first 6,700 years of human health experience as we see it through a glass darkly based on genomic and bioarchaeological evidence. And it's important in its own right, but it's also important as prelude to the disaster that I call the first syndemic. And this was Americas wide. You're probably familiar with this already. In the wake of Columbus, a large proportion of the population of the Americas disappeared within 150 years, and in the Caribbean within 75 years or so. And it looks like it's one of the two greatest health catastrophes in the history of the world, together with the Black Death in Eurasia in the 14th century. So the population of the Americas, when Columbus first showed up, guesswork, my guess is in the 50 to 60 million range. I'm following Linda Newsom here, among the 18 or so people who have proposed serious estimates. I think hers are the best. For the Caribbean, that the range is pretty broad, and some people say only 500,000, some say 8 million. nobody really knows. I'm happy with about 2 million. There are two new kinds of evidence that have destabilized population estimates for the Caribbean. One is new archaeological technique, LIDAR, which means computer-generated imagery from lasers. You can see through, in effect, the forest canopy and find features on the ground that even survey archaeology doesn't find. And in some places, like Amazonia and the Maya lowlands of Belize and Guatemala, and also in Cambodia, LIDAR has found much more extensive evidence of human settlement than archaeologists had previously detected. So they are doubling and sometimes tripling their estimates of pre-Columbian population in these zones. And that makes people think, well, maybe in the Caribbean the numbers are actually higher than we thought. Counter to that is a new study of genetic evidence about the genetic variability within Caribbean populations, from which it's possible to draw inferences about the size of prior populations, although I think this kind of science is still pretty sketchy, and it's above me. Serious genetics is way above me. The people who do that are arguing for a lower overall population of Hispaniola, one island. They haven't expanded that to the Caribbean as a whole. So at the moment, the new science is contradictory. The archaeologists and the geneticists are pushing in different directions. I would predict that in 5 years, the range of plausible estimates will narrow again. But at the moment, it's unstable. So maybe I should have waited 5 years before publishing this. But then other things would become unstable in the interim. So I'm still happy with about 2 million for the Caribbean islands as a whole, half of that population on the island of Hispaniola. What happened to these populations? There are counts undertaken by Spanish authorities beginning in Hispaniola in 1508, and you can see the progressive shrinkage, and counts in Cuba as well. So the short version is, within 75 years, the indigenous population of the Caribbean, which might have been 2 million, fell to a few thousand by the 1570s. This is more acute than the population loss on the mainland of the Americas, which presents another riddle. So as you can see at the bottom, the experience of the mainland is variable. Where there's Spanish settlement, the declines seem to be on the order of 90 to 95%. Where there was no Spanish settlement, on the order of 50 to 75%. So there's a lot of controversy in the scholarship on this health disaster about what lay behind it. To what extent is this a consequence of the brutalities of colonialism? To what extent is it a consequence of the infectious diseases introduced into the region, or something else? And so I tried to look at this in as much detail as I could, and look at the scholarship not just in the Caribbean, but in North and South America as well. And in North America in particular, the weight of scholarly opinion is shifting a little bit away from disease as the agents of depopulation and more towards colonial violence and slave trading, dislocation of family life. And in the Caribbean, I think that carries less weight than it does in North America. Even though there was a lively slave trade of indigenous populations, for the first 60, 70 years of Spanish settlement in the Caribbean. But I don't think that the colonial brutalities is as powerful an explanation in the Caribbean as it is in the mainland. In Mexico and Peru, in the mining districts, and in eastern North America, where scholars like Paul Kelton have changed the argument. Which is not to say there was any shortage of colonial brutality, only that when it came to population reduction, that came second, in my estimation, to the role of infectious disease, amplified by the syndemic effects of colonial violence and associated malnutrition. A couple of the reasons I think this are extra-Caribbean. So I looked, for example, at the long history of Egypt, which has been invaded and colonized a half a dozen or more times in its history, with no shortage of attendant violence and enslavement. And yet, there's very little evidence of population catastrophe in Egypt, and absolutely nothing on the scale of what befell the Caribbean. So that makes me think that you can have colonial brutality in spades without drastic reductions in population. A second extra-Caribbean argument that makes me think the way I do is that the same generation of Spaniards conquered bits of Morocco at the same time that they were conquering bits of the Caribbean and dispossessing the local population, enslaving the local population as best they could. And yet, no impact, as far as any evidence tells us, on the overall population of Morocco. So, those are some extra Caribbean reasons. Then there's also the Pacific Island story, and I looked into this for the first 100 years after Western colonialism in the Pacific, which, because it's more recent, is typically better documented than the experience of the Caribbean prior to 1570. And the record there is of disastrous loss of population amongst the Polynesian and Micronesian populations, but comparatively little colonial violence and enslavement. Rather, a strong evidence of disastrous experience with smallpox, influenza, measles, tuberculosis, and a couple of other acute infections. Much better documented than the Caribbean, but it lends plausibility to the idea that in the Caribbean, disease deserves to be understood as the primary agent of this disaster. And there's some point 8 here, other evidence about indigenous population carried to Spain, Spaniards trying to keep them alive, and huge mortality. So influenza, smallpox, measles, all probably there by 1531. Malaria probably as well. That's a little sketchier. A handful of less significant diseases. Measles is especially important for two reasons. One, it's especially infectious. If you look at the bottom here, the R0 number, as it's called, for measles is at the very end of the range for human infections. This is the most infectious of viruses. It's 2 to 3 times as infectious as Omicron. So that's one reason why measles is really important. The second reason is that measles modern measles, this is probably true in the 16th century as well, has an insidious effect of suppressing immune system memory. It wipes out your immune memory, not just for measles, but for everything, for 2 or 3 years. So if you get measles and you had, for instance, smallpox immunity by surviving smallpox, well, you lose that smallpox immunity for 2 or 3 years and become vulnerable again. So measles is hard to avoid because it's so infectious, and it has this insidious effect, making you vulnerable to other diseases to which you had previously been immune. So that's why it's extra important in this. I've already spoken a little bit about the Pacific Islands. These are more specific numbers collected in more recent epidemics in various parts of the Pacific. 25%, 30%, 40% mortality in a single epidemic was not all that unusual, which makes it easier to believe that such things happen in the Caribbean as well, although they're not well documented. And there's evidence also from Iceland, very good quality data from 1707 of extremely costly smallpox epidemic. So I said that the Caribbean got it worse than the mainland. Why might that be true? I think there's one clear reason, which is location. The Caribbean was the first port of call for shipping coming to the Americas. Brazil was another first port of call. Though it had more frequent introductions of more infections than anywhere in the mainland except possibly northeastern Brazil. And then it was also, most of it, low-lying and humid, which is great for a lot of infections, including mosquito-borne infections like malaria and yellow fever and dengue. That seems pretty straightforward. There is another possibility, and I don't know how seriously to take it. It's fairly complicated. A short version would be that the genetic diversity of the indigenous population of the Caribbean was extremely narrow by world standards. That's not controversial. That is evident from the bio-archeology and also from the genomes of existing Caribbean populations. And it makes sense, too, because the Caribbean was settled originally by just a handful of people coming in from what's now Venezuela. So, as I write here, an average village in Africa has, on most measures, greater genetic diversity than the entire indigenous 2 million people of the Caribbean. And the significance of that would be that because this population was so self-similar genetically speaking, any infection that had evolved in such a way as to get around one person's immune system was also well calibrated to get around the next person's immune system. In the same way that within a family, a cold can transmit among siblings very easily, they too are self-similar genetically speaking. How significant this was in the balance, I'm not sure. And it has to be separated from any notion of genetic inferiority on the part of any population. That is not what this argument consists of. The argument consists of the vulnerability collectively of a population that is self-similar in its genetic profile. But I can't figure out any way to parse how significant this was against other variables that can explain the same thing, why the Caribbean got it worse than any other part of the Americas. Okay, let me move on to the second syndemic, as I call it, the health disaster associated with the plantation regime in the Caribbean, which was preceded by maybe 100 years of pretty good health on the part of the surviving, very small surviving indigenous population and the immigrant population, mainly from Europe and to a lesser extent from Africa prior to 1650. After 1650, the immigrant population was primarily from Africa and in smaller portion from Europe. So the plantation complex, sugar, coffee, indigo, cotton, was installed gradually beginning in the 1640s. And sugar in particular had bad consequences for the health of people who lived in and around sugar plantations. Everywhere in the world where there's sugar, there is a sugar penalty demographically. And in the Caribbean, it consisted partly of yellow fever, as in Louisiana, as in Natal in South Africa. Actually, it's dengue and yellow fever in Natal. And that's because there's an affiliation that sugar plantations have with a particular kind of mosquito, the Aedes aegypti mosquito, that carries yellow fever and dengue. So everywhere there was sugar plantations in the Caribbean, there was yellow fever, which is an extremely dangerous disease to people who have not survived it already. 25%, 50%, 80% mortality rate in certain circumstances. And at the same time, the population of the Caribbean was growing despite this nasty health regime because of the slave trade, because of massive immigration of about 4 million Africans between 1640 and 1860. So 4 million people came. The total population was only 2.2 million because people were dying faster than people were being born in the Caribbean as a result of the plantation regime, which included powerful social components in its syndemic. As I write here, institutionalized oppression and terror, which have effects upon human immune systems, and also outright brutality, killing people. Malaria was also important in this plantation disease regime. The plantation ecology also favored malarial mosquitoes, and the constant influx of people from West Africa meant that malaria, the pathogen of malaria, Plasmodium, was constantly reintroduced in human bloodstreams, so that the mosquito population of the Caribbean was always biting malaria-bearing humans, and therefore transmitting malaria to those humans who had not already encountered malaria, making it well-nigh universal. I divide this plantation regime up into 3 bits: plantations themselves, cities, and armies, because most of the people living in the Caribbean lived in one of these 3 institutional settings. The diseases involved killing people were pretty much the same across plantations, cities, and armies, although maybe in differing proportions. Yellow fever was more important in cities than in the countryside. Malaria was more important in the countryside than in cities. And smallpox and measles more important in cities. But anyway, it was the same general suite of diseases, eventually including dengue, probably by the 18th century, but that's not very confident. One thing that is clear is that people who came to the Caribbean were most at risk of disease in their first weeks and months in the region, because they were encountering often for the first time some of these infectious diseases, particularly yellow fever and malaria. So you can see some of the data here on slave mortality and the mortality amongst Europeans arriving in the region. And those estimates are pretty reliable. The plantations themselves were deadly because of the social oppression in various forms, and it's probably appropriate to emphasize sexual abuse here, and the role of sexually transmitted diseases in suppressing fertility, so that not only were death rates exaggerated because of this disease regime, but fertility rates were suppressed because of this disease regime, helping to account for the demographic sinkhole into which Caribbean populations were placed. And then sugar itself, as I said before, carries a demographic penalty. And I looked at a lot of different settings with sugar, and the range of annual decline in population is between 2 and 5%. And as I note here, that's worse than the Gulag demographic record in the Soviet Union. And interestingly, it's least bad in Barbados, which is the only island that had no malaria. And then this demographic penalty of sugar gradually faded away. It began to diminish at the very beginning of the 19th century while slavery was still in effect. But as slavery was gradually abolished, the demographic penalty of sugar and of plantations generally diminished. In some places, like the Danish West Indies, the demographic penalty of sugar outlasted slavery, but in other places it was over almost at the exact same time that slavery was abolished. Cities also exacted a demographic penalty. People died faster than other people were being born in cities. They were sustained, like the plantations themselves, only by in-migration, partly of slaves, partly of free people. And here, waterborne diseases were especially important, together with yellow fever. The Caribbean was an unusually urbanized region by world standards, mainly because Havana was a really big city from the 18th century onward. And the unusual degree of urbanization meant that urban diseases were particularly important: waterborne diseases, yellow fever, and cholera, when it escaped from South Asia beginning in 1817 and traveled around the world on ships. It in 5 big pandemics in the 19th century, it hit the Caribbean especially hard, as I note here. 3 times it got to the Caribbean and killed several 100,000 people. So it was much more serious there than on the mainland. Mexico had it bad too, but not as bad. The urban demographic penalty disappeared around 1880 to 1900, maybe 1910 at the latest in some places. And that's actually a result of intentional human interventions, sanitation, cleaner water supply, and mosquito control. And I should have said that everywhere around the world, cities exacted a demographic penalty into the 19th century. And that began to end in some places as early as 1850. It's one of the big changes between the modern world and the pre-modern world, that cities no longer kill people faster than others are born in cities. The third component of the plantation regime's health history, as I present it, is armies, because a lot of the population in the Caribbean was military. And happily, because militaries are bureaucratic organizations, we have comparatively good data, especially from the 19th century, but even from the 18th. So armies at peace in the Caribbean had high mortality rates by global standards. I have some data here for British garrisons in the Caribbean, 4 times as high mortality as British garrisons in India, 10 times as high as British garrisons in Canada. This is in Jamaica and the Bahamas, and a little bit better in the smaller islands of the Windwards and the Lourdes. And some data about the Spanish Army and its expectations of mortality when it sent fresh garrisons to Cuba in the 1850s. And the reason for garrison mortality was mainly yellow fever and malaria, because these armies were recruited from landscapes mainly in Europe where yellow fever was absent and malaria was insignificant. So they had no prior exposure, no relevant immunities or resistance, maximal vulnerability. Armies at war suffered even greater disease mortality, largely because they had denser and larger populations, which meant that the circulation of infectious disease was more efficient among them than it was among smaller garrisons posted in 50 guys there, 200 guys there. Large agglomerations of young men from Europe, or in some cases North America, in sieges at Cartagena, at Havana, suffered collective mortality 70–80%, mainly from yellow fever and malaria, but other diseases that are characteristic of military operations, like typhus, as well. This stuff is what I worked on in the book Mosquito Empires. And the Haitian Revolution is another good example of this. Perhaps you can see the extraordinary detail here. There's one expedition of the British Army into what's now Nicaragua in 1780, in which about 80% of the British soldiers died of disease. And that's a larger number of British, this is in the War of the American Revolution, which was fought in the Caribbean as well as on the North American mainland, and fought in India as well. A larger number of soldiers were lost to disease on this one expedition into Nicaragua than in, I think it's the 11 largest battles of the War of the American Revolution. You know, the famous ones, Guilford Courthouse, Cowpens, Trenton, et cetera, et cetera. All right, I'm coming to a close here. So the second syndemic of plantation society, it's possible to understand the entire Caribbean region, the plantations and the cities, as an interconnected web of populations highly vulnerable to disease, like one gigantic, if fragmented city in its health consequences and demographic effect, sustained only by constant infusions of new people, mainly enslaved people from Atlantic Africa, and mainly young men, which is analogous to early modern cities, which were sustained by in-migration of young people, more often male than female. And interestingly, this is a bit different from the North American plantation regime, in which sugar played a much smaller role and cotton a much larger role. The North American plantation regime was biologically self-sustaining by the early 18th century. It was not killing people faster than others were being born, and in fact, the enslaved population in the United States grew, especially in the first half of the 19th century, in sharp contrast to the Caribbean slave population. Why might that be? I think the main reason was less sugar, and therefore the sugar penalty was insignificant outside of Louisiana. But there are other possible explanations. And I also want to point out that this second syndemic of plantation society existed also in Brazil, from Rio de Janeiro north to Bahia, with many similar characteristics to the Caribbean. And I think it's fair to say that the intensity and duration of this second syndemic associated with plantation slavery in the Caribbean is distinctive, if not unique, in world history. 200 years of acute suffering and demographic destruction made good only by a slave trade. So, putting these two syndemics together, the first and the second, we have roughly 350 years of Caribbean health and disease history, which is extremely discouraging. And it had its consequences. In the book Mosquito Empires, I maintain that one of those consequences was that this region stayed under Spanish control successfully, despite repeated attacks, mainly by Britain, that the disease factor worked to defend Spanish power at the expense of invasive forces, and that the revolutions beginning in the 1780s succeeded in part because locally born and raised populations were fighting against populations, armies sent out from Europe to prevent independence in the Caribbean and the mainlands of South America and North America. So I maintain there's a powerful geopolitical consequence of particularly the second syndemic. And while, as far as I know, I'm the only person who makes that argument, and could be the only person who believes it, there's a second consequence that is more obvious and not controversial, which is that the current population of the Caribbean is overwhelmingly of African descent, not indigenous descent, and that is a result of the health and disease history of the two syndemics, particularly the first syndemic. So the Caribbean as we know it, culturally and demographically, is an artifact of that first syndemic. So those are the conclusions that I arrived at. And now I'm going to stop sharing and will gladly address any questions that anybody might have.
Just really quickly, our Zoom audience could not join us.
Oh.
There was a problem with the link, that's why it was up here. But we're still going to record, or we're still recording, so it would be nice to have the Q&A on the recording, I think, so yeah.
Okay. Well, thanks so much. And
It needs to be on. This is on. Okay. That's fine.
okay. So thanks so much. And I've got a million questions. So, but maybe I'll let other people, if you have questions, and then come back.
I don't need a microphone, I'm fine. If you
No,
can-
no, no.
But for the recording, you need the microphone.
Hi, thank you.
Yeah, I put it on group.
Yeah? Okay, great. Hi, thank you, Professor McNeill. It's great having you here. I was also in your talk yesterday via Zoom, so it's great to see both of these, of your intellectual interests and how they come together. Adelina, I'm a student of African history, second year PhD student, and I've been struggling a lot trying to incorporate methods like that in my own work, especially trying to find paleogenomics and genetics for indigenous African populations and communities, and trying to understand how these may have kind of like impacted the development of African societies before the first of like encounter with Europeans. So I was wondering if you can talk a bit more about your methodology and where you go to find those sources and how you develop kind of like these techniques. Do you train separately on, did you need additional training when you went into this sort of like work to understand how to read and how to work with these methods?
Okay, so with respect to the second half, did I need additional training? The answer is yes, but I didn't get it. I have tried to interpret the paleogenomics myself, but fortunately for me, I work on a campus and have worked on a campus long enough that I know a lot of people in my biology department, including geneticists. So when I run into things that I think are important that I cannot understand, I have people who can explain it to me. And they will take the time to do so because they've known me for 20 years. There have been other incidences in my life as a researcher where I tried to get scientists whom I didn't know to help me understand something and was just blown off because they don't care about history and they don't know me and they're busy people. So there's a benefit of having human relationships with experts that I have benefited from. If I were a graduate student, I wouldn't have these relationships, and I would then either need to cultivate them somehow, which is not that easy, or educate myself so that I could interpret paleogenomic data myself, which can be done, but it's not easy. And a great deal depends on one's prior education in biology and in mathematics. So given that, what is my method? My method is to read all the papers that pertain to Caribbean paleogenomics, which is actually feasible because there's only about 20 of them. There are, in this country, a few scientists a few geneticists who are interested in the Caribbean, and in the Dominican Republic, there's another, but they're not a whole lot. In 5 years, there's going to be 200 such papers. I could still look at 200 papers, but it's a whole lot easier now than it's going to be to get a grip on the existing literature. With respect to Africa, it's also a moving target. There are probably new papers produced at least once a month dealing with paleogenomics in Africa. Sarah Tishkoff's lab is one of the main producers of papers on African paleogenomics. But there's not much emanating from Africa itself. I'm not aware of any genetics labs in Africa that are interested in paleogenomics. There could be one in Nigeria or one in South Africa, but I haven't come across them. But I'm not intensively trying to study that either. So my method consists of PubMed and Google Scholar.
Right. Thank you.
Do you want to go ahead?
But you're going to find that this is probably even more important in pre-colonial African history than it is in Caribbean history until you get to pre-Columbian, because of the paucity of written sources and the paucity of archaeology, depending on what part of Africa you're working on. What part of Africa are you working on?
Well, not Ghana, so Gold Coast, but
Okay.
West Africa.
Yeah, so paucity of archaeology, paucity of written sources prior to 1850 means that the relative significance of other kinds of data, natural archives, is ultimately going to be bigger. But it's going to take some time for scientists to produce it. And you can't produce it yourself, just like I can't produce paleogenomic studies for the Caribbean myself.
Yeah, thank you, Professor. I'm Jason. I was at the talk last night, and I think being able to see a new project, your most recent project, and then alluding to a project that you had done in the past is really helpful to kind of see, the intellectual development of bringing all those things together. So that was really cool. But my question was, is there a traceable difference between the colonial attitudes towards what was happening in each of these locations, as they varied by either the British Empire or Spanish or French Empire abroad, as to who's dying and how they're dying? How are they becoming aware? When is that golden moment where they're like, we're doing this with our bodies and being in that place? And was there any effort to try and reverse that process and potentially put Europeans within Western Africa into more the country to try and maybe expose people to some of those diseases while the slave trade was still ongoing?
Into Western Africa?
Yes. Was there an awareness of white bodies being in the Caribbean and introducing disease among the slave populations there, so that they were dying at such a high rate? When did that awareness come to the fore? And why were there no efforts to kind of try and stop it once they understood? Or was it a much later understanding of what was happening to those people?
It was a much later understanding. So to use the fancy word, the etiology of all these infectious diseases was worked out beginning only in the 1890s. And that's with respect to mosquito-borne diseases. With respect to the breath-borne viral diseases like smallpox, measles, mumps, the etiology of them was only worked out in the 20th century, although people had already known that somehow these must be transmissible, not that they would use that word, from person to person, just because it became obvious that people who were close to sick people were likelier to get sick themselves than people who kept their distance. That's why quarantines were employed in the Caribbean on a small scale from the 18th century, on a large scale in the 19th century. With respect to Europeans in West Africa, they suffered extreme mortality in the context of the various trades, which were overwhelmingly the slave trade, in the 17th, 18th, and early 19th century. They tried very hard not to go ashore, but there were garrisons stationed there, which had annual wastage rates of 50% on average, probably mainly yellow fever and malaria, but some other infections as well. There's a fair bit of scholarship on this going back to a guy named Philip Curtin in the 1960s. And the data are pretty good from the military populations, but also the Royal African Company, the British company that was mainly responsible for the 18th century slave trade. And there's also good data on Middle Passage mortality, both among slaves and among crews. And what to me is very telling, is a brilliant study somebody did of the insignificance of having doctors on shipboard. The mortality rates were a teeny bit higher for voyages with doctors than without doctors, but not much different.
What about Indigenous doctors?
So this is a whole new subject that is very cloudy. So the surviving evidence concerning indigenous healers in the Caribbean or in Africa, the surviving evidence is very slender about the practices that they employed, some of which were sort of exchanged so that slave populations in the Caribbean were learning a few things from the surviving remnant of indigenous population in the Caribbean. And in some very limited cases, the European population was also borrowing some of these medical approaches. They saw some evidence that their own medical approaches were completely useless, and so try something else. But the effectiveness of this, very little evidence one way or another. So that's one of the great gaps in the health history, and particularly the history of medicine, both of the Caribbean and of West Africa. There's some people working on it. I can't remember her first name, but her last name was Winterbottom. Caroline, maybe? But it's tough to get good evidence about that. Although, depending on how far back, I'm mainly thinking in the context of the 18th century. 19th century would be easier, and oral traditions would be more powerful. There might be less of a problem for the 19th century.
Before I ask my question, I'll just add a note of curiosity that the common names for a lot of South Florida plants come from Bahamian settlers and often have to do with medicinal aspects. So there's a whole series of plants called stoppers that are used against diarrhea, and there's a these are plants I have in my yard, but there's one called strong back or strong bark because it was used for other medicinal purposes and so forth. But my question goes back to Jared Diamond's work about Eurasia. I mean, part of his broad work, but how Eurasia was different than the Americas, because Eurasia, you had climate zones, and domesticated animals could go, and domesticated plants could spread east-west and more easily than north-south. And you made the point about lack of domesticated animals. So that's obviously one way that diseases aren't going to spread around the Americas, because llamas and alpacas, can't go north very far. Are there other ways in which, I mean, is Jared Diamond right on that, do you think? But are there other ways than domesticated animals that might have made the Caribbean freer from disease before the arrival of Europeans, and thus perhaps more vulnerable?
Okay, the answer to the last part of that question is yes, and a big part of it is one thing I mentioned, which is the comparatively short history of agriculture in the Caribbean, 2,500 years, as opposed to 10 or 12,000 years in at least parts of Eurasia. So I think Diamond is very useful in his argument that Eurasia, and he should have said Northeast Africa as well, is the home of most of the important domesticated herd animals that humans use. Cattle, sheep, goats, pigs, camels, horses. Cattle appear to have been domesticated first in northeastern Africa, not in Eurasia. The others probably first in Eurasia, and mainly in the area that we call the Middle East, although horses were elsewhere. And for disease history, infectious disease history, this is a really important fact, and it explains a lot about the Americas, about Australia, about Pacific Islands, as opposed to Eurasia. Eurasian populations were sooner and more pervasively exposed to a handful of infectious diseases, more so than populations anywhere else in the world. Those populations elsewhere in the world, when first introduced to the whole suite simultaneously, suffered grievously, whether it was the Pacific Islands, whether it was Australia, whether it was the Americas. Diamond and his emphasis on domesticated animals is very useful there. The tilted axes argument of Diamond, I think, is unpersuasive. After all, there are cattle in South Africa and in Sweden. And there are horses just about everywhere that there are humans. I think that argument is more significant when it comes to plants and their spreads, in which belts of latitude are more convenient to spread along than belts of longitude. But for animals, I don't think there's much to it. But the first part of it, the accident, well, let me qualify that. Probably the total number of potentially domesticable species was far higher in Eurasia and Africa than in the Americas or anywhere else. So maybe it's not best understood as an accident, but just a function of biogeography and the distribution of potentially domesticable species. So I go a long way with Diamond on that, but not all the way.
Thanks.
Hi, Dr. McNeill. I had a question. sort of related to, in my mind anyway, sometimes current happenings shape how we look at the past. So I'm wondering, sort of how the COVID-19 pandemic might have sharpened your perception or, made you look at certain things in preparation for your talk today.
Well, the COVID-19 pandemic has been a really, really, really bad thing for the human race. If it has a silver lining, it might be that more people are more prepared to take disease seriously as a component of human history and be interested in the kinds of arguments that I'm making. I and dozens of other historians are interested in the role of disease in human history. I left out of this presentation something that I wrote in the conclusion of this book about COVID-19 in the Caribbean, which was evolving as I was writing this. And initially, the Caribbean had a really good experience with COVID-19, and it looked like the Caribbean governments were on top of it, and the populations were being suitably careful. And I wrote about this and argued that they had a front row seat at the disaster that was unfolding in Colombia, Mexico, and Florida. And because they're so culturally connected to these three places, they saw COVID-19 and the mishandling of it by public authorities. And they had no illusions that their own islands had the resources that Florida has to deal with it. So that made them careful. And that was a good argument for about a year. But then things changed. And some parts of the Caribbean have had a bad COVID-19 experience in the last year. And so my initial argument, well, maybe it was valid for a year, but it's not valid in general. And even though I did write about COVID-19 in the epilogue to that book, what I say is getting outdated fast, and in 2 years is going to look really dated. But I couldn't leave it out altogether. Such a shadow hanging over the subject.
Well, we're just about close to 2. I don't know if there's any other questions.
I had a quick one.
Absolutely.
Sorry, when you were talking about what was exceptional about the Caribbean as far as like the amount of people who died as a result of diseases, when you were comparing that with North America to a certain extent, were you looking at the things in North America that were also exceptional and then seeing if they had a complementary version of that in the Caribbean, or was it okay if they were like mutually exclusive? I guess what I'm asking is, you had the Little Ice Age, which was definitely probably playing a role in North America, but maybe not so much in the Caribbean. Was that something that factored into it, or is it because it was only probably North American exclusive, you just found it not to be that important? Or was it important?
So the comparison that I drew was between the health and demography of the slave plantation regime in the Caribbean and in North America, basically the U.S. South. And they're quite different, as I said. The only other place where I compare things to North America is something I didn't talk about. There are a few places where that are pretty well documented in terms of the first syndemic, Amerindian disease mortality in parts of Canada, for example, seems pretty well documented. So I also wrote about that in comparison to the Caribbean. But not much else in what I wrote or presented today makes the comparison to North America. The Little Ice Age it has effects in the Caribbean, but they're not effects that translate into demographic impacts. Probably a tiny effect on the frequency of El Nino events, which are associated with changes in mosquito population and mosquito disease. But the total consequence that can be laid at the door of the Little Ice Age is tiny in the Caribbean. In North America, it's larger because it raised the probability of crop failure and famine that would exacerbate disease tolls and have at least a temporary, always temporary, effect on demography.
Well, with that, I think we'll call it a day. Thanks so much for a great paper and a great visit. And I guess we'll say appreciate it a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hugh. And thanks to all of you for sticking it out.
And I like the notion of syndemics. Thanks for bringing that to our attention.
Yes.
That's very useful.
So do we need to end the recording or and then edit this part out?
Okay.
Just for time,
No.